Availability is just the availability, the presence of public transport close to where you live. So how long do I have to walk to get to a public transport stop? Typically, the literature has found that the cutoff is around 500 meters for people. Beyond 500 meters or 400 meters, depends on which papers you look at. Beyond that point, there's a sharp cutoff in the number of people who are willing to walk longer to get to a public transport stop. Now, if you have metro, that's a different story. Then people are willing to walk longer. So any form of mass transit, BRT, metro, so on and so forth, people will be willing to walk longer. But for your average bus stop, people are not willing to walk more than 500 meters. So that's having a bus stop close to where you live, availability. The second metric that we look at is accessibility. This we measure using how long it would take or rather, what is the share of jobs that you can reach within 60 minutes using public transport? This is a standard index that is used at the World Bank and many other organizations, and that's what we use. Affordability is the cost of public transportation, and then acceptability and safety we spoke about. So we use this framework to look at what is the barrier for women. We look at 3 different cities. We look at Amman, which is the capital of Jordan, Beirut, which is the capital of Lebanon, and Cairo, which is the capital of Egypt. These are 3 capitals, metropolises of their own right, and they're very varying in size. So Cairo is the biggest, Amman second, and then Beirut is the smallest. And so what are the types of data that we collect? We collect household data for both men and women. We collect what we call intercept data as well, which relates to public transport users. We collect built environment audits of public transport stops. And lastly, we collect GTFS data for the entire public transit network. So we collect these 4 sources of data systematically across these 3 countries, or rather cities. And what this does is it gives us different moments of the data to understand what is going on. And that is what we use in our estimation. So let's move on to the next slide. So what I'm going to do next is I'm not going to present to you the methodology that we followed. That's quite complex, convoluted. We have 4 sets of data. Rather, I'll walk you through some of the results that we have. And I encourage you to read the report. There's a lot of richness there. So I've condensed it, I think, into 6 key findings. But there's a lot more there in terms of what we did and what you can find. So the first thing that we look at is who's using public transport system and how is it varying across the 3 cities. We find across the 3 cities, we look at private motorized transport, taxi, and public transportation. The first thing that we find is that usage varies quite a bit across cities. Cairo, people use, both men and women are more likely to use public transport than women. In Amman, they're less likely to use public transport, and in Beirut, they're even less likely to use public transport. So the first thing is that your cities might be very heterogeneous in terms of public transport versus private transportation usage. And yes, this is because Cairo has a much more densely developed public transit system. Whether it is enough for the city, a city size of Cairo is a different story, but it is much denser than Beirut and Amman as well. The second thing that we find is that on average across the cities, men tend to be more reliant on private transportation modes, use their own cars, their own motorcycles than women. So you see the first bar, which is black for men, light blue for women, is always higher for men than for women. So across the cities, no matter how densely developed or poorly developed your public transit system is, we find that it is true that men are users of motorized transport, whereas women are not users of motorized transport. A lot more women will use taxis, and in some cities, more women will also use public transit, right? But that is not the case in Cairo. That is also not the case in Amman, where things are pretty flat. So that's the first finding. This pattern will vary across cities, and of course, it varies across gender. The second thing that we ask is respondents in terms of what are the challenges that they face. Now, oftentimes, I'm told that, oh, if you want to do something for women, you should improve safety in public transport. I agree in a lot of contexts that is the number one thing that you can improve to improve a woman's journey in public transportation. But what we find is that there are many other factors that women also care about. any sort of basic deficiency in the public transit system is going to impact both men and women. There are certain elements that are going to impact women more. So when we ask people to list their top 3 challenges, and we ask them to in fact rank them, this is what we find. In Amman, we find that the ride being uncomfortable, which can have some elements of safety in it, is the #1 constraint. The second constraint is length of trip. So the trips are too long. And the third is that there are no waiting areas at public transit stops or bus stops, in this case, where women can wait. When we ask the same question in Beirut, women raise the issue of road safety, which is different from safety as we understand it for women, which is more security, right? So elements of road safety were the #1 thing that women in Beirut mentioned. The second most important barrier for them was that public transit is too expensive. And the third is that it is uncomfortable. So you see the challenges vary and the ranking of those challenges varies. Third, in Cairo, the #1 challenge that women face is the length of trips. Second is wait times, and third is that the trips are too expensive. So between affordability, safety, overall length of trip, these are some of the key challenges, but the ones that are the most binding will vary across cities, as you see in this figure. Now, we also ask women to identify different areas of improvement. By the way, we asked the same questions to men. Our sample was pretty balanced. In this talk, I'm focusing on women's choices. So I'm presenting to you moments of data from the women's choice decision-making process. But in the full report, you will see that we report results for men as well. One thing I will say is that the challenges that both women and men report are relatively similar, but the way that they weight them is quite different in some of the areas, including lack of comfort and so on and so forth, which has elements of safety in it, of course. So we also ask men and women in 2 of the cities, Amman and Beirut, to tell us, okay, so you've identified the challenges, what are the solutions, what would you want us to fix? And so when we ask them this question for transport services, which is, for example, a bus ride is a transport service, we also asked about ancillary infrastructure. So that relates to more the built environment of the bus stop, the connectivity to the bus stop, and so on and so forth. So we asked them to distinguish between these two. And in Amman, we find that the #1 thing that women want us to fix is the coverage. So have better coverage of the public transit system. Amman has this issue of buses not stopping where they're supposed to stop and not coming on time. So fixed stops and scheduling was the second most important constraint that they highlighted. And then the third one is that they wanted bus service to be more frequent. This again goes to the issue of you don't want to be waiting in public for a long time. You want buses to arrive more frequently so that you can leave. The same question was asked in Beirut. And in Beirut, the #1 thing that women wanted fixed is the cost of public transportation. This is not surprising. All of you know that Lebanon has been in a bit of a financial crunch for the last 5 years or so, and the cost of living is too high. So it is no surprise that women are very concerned about the cost of public transportation, followed by coverage, and then followed by comfort, and then coverage. In terms of ancillary infrastructure, women in Amman wanted waiting areas as the most important investment that can be made, followed by bathroom facilities, followed by quality of pavement. And this is an important issue in Amman. From my visits, I've seen that all their pavements sometimes are either missing or they're uneven. So you'll have one building that has a very high pavement, then the next building has a very low pavement, and the third building may not have a pavement. And in their pavement, they also plant trees. So it's a decorative pavement. It's not meant for walking. I walk these pavements, and I have a newfound appreciation for this constraint or rather area of improvement that they identified. When we look at Beirut, in terms of ancillary infrastructure, women wanted wait areas, they wanted lighting. This is an important constraint for Beirut because in Beirut, because of the power situation, Beirut is not able to generate their own power. They live on mostly source power through captive means. All these bus stops have no street lights. So there are street lights, but they're not lit. So this is a key constraint for Beirut that comes through in our data. And then, of course, access roads to bus stops is another constraint. So that is our second finding, that women across cities also are looking for different things to be improved in their public transit system. Now, a lot of these will be similar, but there will be quite a few differences. And what this highlights is to really, when you're designing these public transport systems, is to know your audience, to know who's going to be your users, and to address the constraints that they have. A lot of times, basic deficiencies in your public transit system will impact both men and women. Some of them will impact women a lot more. So as you design inclusive public transport systems, this is something that you want to keep in mind. Now let's move on to what does this mean for women's labor supply, right? The last three results were related more to various moments of the data that we saw. Next, we look at, okay, so there are deficiencies, there are aspects that people want improved. If we improve the public transport system, is there going to be a substantial increase in women's labor force participation or a substantial increase in their employment, right? So will it fix, or will it rather partly explain part of the paradox that I mentioned earlier, which is women's low labor force participation? So the next three set of results is going to focus on that a little bit. We'll start by looking at more self-reported data, and then I'll show you some of the empirical analysis that we did to also validate these findings. So result number 4, we find when we ask non-working women whether they would be willing at all to work, we find that women in all three cities express what we call a latent desire to work. So there is a desire to work in them, but they're not able to work for various constraints that we'll look at next. So we ask non-working women whether they would be willing to accept a job if it were available. The numbers were quite stark. This comes from our household survey, by the way, so these are not necessarily public transport users. These are all women, randomly selected across the three cities. We find that in Amman, 65% of non-working women would be willing to accept a job if it were available. This share in Beirut is 59%, and this share in Cairo is 67%. We then also ask them, okay, so if you're willing to work, potentially, hypothetically, then what is preventing you from working? And a sizable share of women reported that transport barriers were preventing them from looking for a job. So in Amman, 6 in 10 of the women who said that they would be willing to work say that a transport barrier is preventing, some sort of transport barrier is preventing them from looking for work. In Beirut, this share is 5 in 10, and in Cairo, this share is 4 in 10. So quite a bit of sizable share of women say that transportation is a barrier for them. This is not to say that there are not other barriers that bind. So on this slide, I'll show you what are some of the transport barriers that they mention, and also show you the relative importance of non-transport related barriers. So let's look at transport barriers first. For Amman, women reported cost and length as the two most important transport barriers. In Beirut, cost, as I mentioned, was by far the biggest barrier because the country is running through a financial crunch. In Cairo, the length and cost were the most important barriers that this set of women highlighted. And now again, this set of women comes from the household surveys, so these are not necessarily public transport users. These are all women, so to speak, who are not working in our sample and who report a transport barrier. So you would expect things that a broader set of pool of sample population highlights to be different from a subset of the population, which would be the public transport users. So that's what I meant when I said that we look at different moments of this data. We look at public transport users, and then we look at users overall. Now, in terms of non-transport related constraints, in Amman, the number one non-transport related constraint that women highlight are family preferences, whereas in Beirut and Cairo, they highlight what we call domestic duties, so to speak, that prevent them from commuting for work. Now, this is all self-reported data, right? So we didn't stop here. A lot of times people are able to very easily report on their income, their education, those there's little measurement error in those self-reported data. But when you ask people about their choices, it could be that they feel pressure to say one thing versus another. They also might feel pressure to hide something. So typically when we ask these sorts of questions, I always try to corroborate it with other pieces of evidence. So next I'm going to show you what we did in that sense, right? So we look, so there's a sizable sample that says, okay, we would be willing to work if you provided us with a better transportation system. Next, we look in terms of observed outcomes, whether a woman is working or not, to the quality of the public transport system that she's facing. So that is why the GTFS data comes in very handy, because we've mapped the public transit network in all 3 cities. And now we're going to compute different measures of that public transport system that these women are facing, because we also know where they live. So in our household survey, we have their GPS data lat long codified, right? So for wherever a woman's house is, or a man's house is for that matter, we are able to estimate what is the accessibility of jobs through public transport system for that house location, what is the availability of public transportation close to that residential location, and what is the safety measure, so to speak, of the built environment at bus stops that that woman is most likely to use. So again, accessibility is the share of jobs that you can reach through a public transport system or walking within 60 minutes. Availability is an index that looks at how close a bus stop is to where you live, and safety is a measure of the bus stop built environment quality. Think of it as perceived safety. So how safe would a woman on average feel at that bus stop that she has access to from her home? So these are the 3 measures that we will compute, and we will then look at how variance in these 3 measures will impact a woman's choice in our data to be participating in the labor force or not. So participating in the labor force is either you're working or you're actively looking for a job. So this is what our accessibility measure looks like. You'll see the maps of the 3 cities on the right-hand side. In Amman, 18% of jobs are accessible within 60 minutes of a using public transportation. In Beirut, which is a smaller city and much more densely populated city, it has more vertical development, 30% of jobs are accessible. And in Cairo, which is a much larger city, only 13% of jobs are accessible by public transport. So this is our first index that we use. The second index that we use is that of availability. And as I mentioned, this is a composite index that we created for proximity to a public transit stop. It takes into account how far the closest public transport stops are to a house and how frequent service to those stops is. So we create a composite index combining location as well as frequency of service. So if you have a stop that is right outside my house, but bus comes every 1 hour, that's not good enough, right? So we balance the 2, the number of stops, how much you have to walk, with the frequency to create a composite index. The third measure that we create is that of safety. And for this measure of safety, in fact, we borrow a methodology from this NGO in India. It's called Safety Pin. A lot of you might be familiar with it. They have posited a framework that comprises of all these variables that you see on the side. So you can go to any location, a bus stop, a street, and assess that location based on this metric and use it. The one step that we took further is we measured this for bus stops, and then we created a composite index normalized to 100, well, normalized to be between 0 and 1 or 0 and 100% to assess the safety. So the higher the value, the safer a location would be in terms of quote unquote safety for both men and women. So what are some of the measures that we use? Lighting at night is an important one. Availability of walking paths is an open one. Openness of a location, which is how open do I feel a bus stop is important. And then visibility of that bus stop. So visibility is when other people can see where I am. So are there some shops around where people can see that I'm at the bus stop, and if someone is harassing me, then someone can come and help me. So that's visibility, whereas openness is how open is the bus stop from me as a user perspective. Presence of security at the bus stop, number of people there around the bus stop, and most importantly, the decomposition of the people there. So what is the gender usage of that bus stop? Is it all men? Is it all women? Is it somewhere in between 50-50? So we measure all these things for the bus stops that we have. We identify the bus stops that are close enough to the location of where these women are living. And using that, we create this composite index that you see on the right-hand side of safety. Now, next, we put all of this data together in regression analysis. We control for women's education, marital status, presence of children, presence of elderly in the household. We also include district fixed effects. These are large cities, so they have quite a few districts. And controlling for everything that we think should be controlled for, we then look at whether controlling for all the choices that a woman makes, education, marriage, number of children, elderly in the household, district fixed effects to take away some sort of income effects or rather well-being effects. We look at whether availability, accessibility, and safety explain part of the labor force participation rate that we're seeing for these women. And this is what we find. We find that in the 3 cities, women's labor force participation is differently influenced by accessibility, availability, and safety, and that these constraints also vary by income level. So when we stratify our sample by richer households versus poorer households, we see differential results as well. So here's a snapshot of what we find. In Amman, when we look at our sample of all women, we find that safety impacts women's decision to work or not. So as you make the bus system or the transit system safer, we should expect an increase in women's labor force participation. This is for all women, whether they're from high-income households or low-income households. When we look at the sample for low-income households specifically, we find that instead accessibility to jobs is what matters. So we take this to mean that women from low-income households, because they really have to work, they are willing to brave an unsafe transit system if you can make jobs available to them through better transportation, make it faster to get to these jobs, they will participate in the labor force. So that is the result that we find in Amman. In Beirut, we find no impacts for women overall, but when we look at women from the low-income households, we find again that accessibility matters for them. In Cairo, we find that in the sample of all women, both accessibility to jobs and availability of public transport close to where you live impact a woman's decision whether to participate in the labor force or not. So again, in all 3 cities, we find that public transport system is a key constraint in terms of the observed labor force participation of these women, and that the constraint that we find varies varies across these 3 cities. In Amman, it's safety. In Cairo, it's accessibility and availability, for example. So we found these results. We have the coefficients for these. So we have a quantitative assessment of what it means for improving a public transport system. So here's a thought exercise that we did for Amman, and we did a similar thought exercise for Cairo. So based on our results in Amman, we found that a 5 percentage point improvement in safety at bus stops was going to increase women's labor force participation from 13.6% to 18.3%. Based on the population of Amman, this corresponds to around 59,000 additional women in the labor force. Now, if you can find a way that all these additional women who are participating in the labor force are in fact able to find jobs, then using the average wage rate in Amman, we know that these women can add 356 million Jordanian dinar to the economy, which is 2.3% increase in Amman's GDP. So here's a value proposition of, okay, when you enable all these more women to work, if they're able to find jobs, of course, it's demand and supply. There has to be a supply of jobs as well. Then it could contribute significantly to the GDP of a particular city or a country, so to speak. We did a similar exercise in the report for Cairo. I won't present it here today in the interest of time. The last result that I will present on this is that we looked at women's labor force participation as yet. We also looked at their employment outcomes. So labor force participation is, again, either you're working or you're looking for a job. Employment is that you have a job. So you have a job that you found. We did the same analysis, changed the outcome variable from labor force participation to employment, and we found that there's no final impact on employment of the variables that we look at. So how should we infer this result, right? So our inference of this is that while improving the public transport system is making women more likely to look for jobs, this more likelihood of looking for a job is not translating into employment opportunities for them, because there might be other structural barriers that are binding. So it could be that the work environment at these places that they're interviewing at is not, they don't find it good, so they don't want to join these places. There might be discrimination in terms of hiring practices. It could be unbiased, unknown bias, or what we call bias that you don't know that you have some sort of bias in you. Or it could be that while women are willing to look for jobs, when it comes to, okay, I have to now go and do this every day, that's not a choice that they're willing to make just yet. So there are other barriers that prevent us from transporting their labor force participation into actual employment. And so you really want to, as you improve the public transport system, you also want to be addressing these other structural barriers that may exist. We didn't do a deep dive into what these barriers could be, but that could be future work. Now, from all this, I've been talking for like a good half an hour at least, no? Yes, for sure. So from all these findings that I'm showing you, right, the number one key takeaway is, for me at least, is that don't treat all women as just one entity and they have one or two constraints. Women are different. They respond differently to the public transport system that they have in different cities. They also respond differently to their personal circumstance in life, right? So through all these findings, there's one thing that I've shown you is that women's constraints, their desires, the opportunities that they see vary across cities, and they also vary across income groups, right? So their needs vary by income groups, their needs also vary by cities. We also find that a well-functioning public transport system is necessary to improve women's economic participation in MENA. It is necessary, but it is not sufficient. So for it to be sufficient, you need to be doing other things with it, right? The other structured barriers that I mentioned. Overall, looking at the different moments of the data, some of which I showed you today, some of which I didn't, public transport users, households overall, men versus women, what we find is that some of the key constraints that people report in terms of binding constraints are coverage of network, affordability, walkability of cities. In some cities, safety appears to be an issue, and that highlights the need to also ensure that you develop customized solutions for cities. So in Beirut, for example, if I want to do a public transport intervention, I will focus very heavily on lighting and on road safety, because that's a key constraint that exists in Beirut, and it's going to impact both men and women. It will impact women more, in my view. And so really what you want to be doing is designing these more customized interventions, and you also want to be designing more complementary interventions. So don't just address public transport issues, you need to also think about what are some of the interventions that are needed in other sectors to get you to your final goal, if that goal is enhancing women's labor force participation. So with that, I'll stop. You see the QR code for the report at the bottom, so you can scan it and get access to the report. You also, I'm sure the slides can be circulated afterwards as well. So I'll stop here and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you for that interesting session, ma'am. We are grateful for the time and effort you took to deliver the session for us. Now the forum is open for discussion.
Hello, good evening. This is Shahim, as Principal Scientist from NATPAC. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay. So what is the existing public transport share in these cities?
So public transport fare is something that we collected. The reason we don't, in fact, we were also planning on coming up with the affordability index to use in our regression. That was our original goal, is to have the full 4A framework in our regression analysis. So in Amman, it is roughly between half a JD to 1 JD that you pay. In terms of currency conversion, 1 JD is 1.4 US dollars. So to the Indian
No, I am
rupee,
asking about the mode share. I am asking about the mode
mode
share. What
share.
is
Oh,
public
okay.
transport?
Sorry, I thought you said. Okay, so in Cairo, it is the highest. In Amman, it's somewhere in the middle, and in Beirut, it's very low. So I would say in Amman and Beirut, in Amman, it's around 13% mode share. In Beirut, it is in single digits, and in Cairo, it's in the 40%, 50% range.
So, you have studied regarding different aspects, but did you take care about the first mile and last mile connectivity? That is very with the importance of that in the public transport share, etc.
Excellent. So yes, so we did it in the following way, right? So I'll talk about our regression analysis, and that is why it is so important to look at the full journey, right? And look at moments of that journey. So there's two indexes that we use. One is the accessibility index, which looks at the share of jobs that you can reach within 1 hour. So what does that journey include, right? You have to leave your house, walk to a public transport stop, wait over there, get on a bus. It depends on how frequent the bus is, the route that it takes, its speed, get off where you want to go, and then walk to your job, right? So that's the full journey that we look at, and we look at what is the share of jobs that is accessible. So that includes the first mile as well as the last mile that you have to see or witness or walk through. So that's one way where we look at in our analysis the first on the last mile. Second, I really wanted to isolate the impact of the first and last mile. That is why we look at our availability index. So what is the availability index? It's a composite index of how frequent a public transport service is to a bus stop close to your place. It takes into account how long you need to walk to that bus stop, and it looks at also how many bus stops are within a walking distance range, for your house. So that sort of isolates the impact of the first mile at least. We didn't know where these people worked. We tried to document that information as well, but it's never successful. I've tried this in India, I've tried this in the Middle East, I've tried this in Africa as well. People cannot tell us where they work. Or maybe they don't want to, right? So we couldn't look at the last mile, but we look at the overall journey, which includes the first mile through the accessibility index. We also look at the first mile that they have, quote unquote, first mile that they have to do in terms of the availability index that we use in our regression, and see if that first mile has a differential impact. And we find that in fact it does.
So in our cities, Indian cities, we are promoting the free transport for women. So that is a good policy. Or what do you think about that?
So my lips will be sealed on that policy. To be quite frank, I think, look, there's different ways of addressing transport barriers that women face, right? If you think that cost is the most important barrier, then you can think of free transportation, right? But if you think instead that safety is a barrier or accessibility is a barrier, then what is making transport free doing for them, right? It's helping them a little bit, but it's not addressing the key constraint that they face. So as you think about what to do, whether free transport is a good option or not, you have to think about what is the binding constraint that women are facing. Is the binding constraint affordability? Then yes, subsidizing transportation or free transportation as an extreme makes sense. If instead the binding constraint is the time it takes to reach your job and to come back, then you need to make public transport faster, more frequent, more closer to where people live. Now, if instead the constraint that you think exists or based on your data, is security or safety, then you need to be making public transport safer. So it depends.
Thanks, ma'am, for your wonderful presentation and informative session. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments?
Yeah, in the chat box, something. Chandni, can you read it out? Yes.
Could you share the
sample
sample size, data collection procedure, as well as the method used for data validation? Excellent. Okay. So when I started this work, I was really trying to see if I can collect data using cell phone information. So every single city has a record of, based on of course you have to go to the telecom company. You can get exact location of where they live. So it's much cheaper to do a survey by phone, right? So that was my first go-to. I quickly realized that in any of these three cities, it was going to be very difficult to take that route. So that I excluded, but that's not something that I had done before. So I was really curious to do that. So of course, the second best thing that you can do is use a more conventional approach to data collection, right? Now, given the time that I had, the budget that I had, the more conventional approach seemed like a surer shot. So I'll tell you what is the data that we collected, what are our sample sizes, and how we collected that data, right? So we collect 4 sources of data. The most important data that you want to collect for any city, if it is not available, is the GTFS data. For Cairo, I found that this data was already collected by a different World Bank team, so I just adopted it. For Amman and Beirut, I collected this data, and now other people are using this data that I collected previously. So whatever you get, you give forward. So that's the first source of data. This is a full coverage of the public transit system. It's anything that is fixed route. So it's not just buses. In Amman, for example, you have these like white cars, 4-seaters. They also offer a fixed service. So you really have to know the city that you're operating in and identify all modes of transport that are fixed service. In some countries, for example, a tuk-tuk would also be a fixed service, right? So you have to map all of those out. So that's the first set of data. That's the universe. As I understand it, there might be some measurement error, but we validated the data several times, made sure that people went back and forth several times on a particular route to identify any of the offshoots that exists. So that's how we validated that set of data. Now, and one of the things that we also did is we got government records of what are the routes to look against them. And in fact, one of the governments found that their record was quite inaccurate. So now we're helping them update their route record, so to speak, for public transit. The second source of data that we collected are public transit intercept surveys. So you stopped a public transport user at a stop, either they're getting on or getting off, and interview them for like 5 minutes, 10 minutes. We collected, I believe, around 2,000 of those samples across cities, 50% men and 50% women. Let me pull up the slide to make sure I am. Yeah, I think that sounds about right. And these were collected based on the frequency that you see at a bus stop. More frequent bus stops that are bigger, we collected a larger sample from. We did stratify by gender because we really wanted to get to women, but otherwise the sample was representative geographically, and as well as the frequency that you see at that bus stop. We also tried to stratify it a little bit by peak versus off-peak time so that we're getting all views, not just a select set of views. Of course, we encountered some issues in the data collection for this particular segment in Amman, where we were not able to get enough samples. So then we had to, runtime, make an adjustment to our sampling methodology to get the right sample size, or enough samples rather. Now, in terms of household surveys, again, our sample size was 2,000 households. For half the households, we interviewed women of a working age. For the other half of households, we interviewed men for working age. Now, it's very valid to ask, okay, why don't you capture men and women from the same household? The simple answer to this is that I have done that before. I did that in the context of Mumbai, I believe. And what I found is that the answers were between men and women were extremely similar. And the enumerators, one of the reasons that they told me is that, look, houses are small. So when we interview one person, the other person is able to hear. So sometimes they're asking us, oh, why are you asking me the same question? And some of the responses are what she said or what he said previously, right? So there's just, when you try to interview 2 people from the same household, there's going to be a lot of confirmation bias, so to speak. So that's why this time around, when I did this kind of survey, I decided that we're going to interview women from some households and men from some households. This was stratified based on population data that we had for this like sub-district level, and in some cases enumeration level, right? So that's how we stratified it. That's how we sampled it geographically, and then we stratified based on gender. So those are the main sources of data that we collected. No, last data set that we collected is the built environment audit for select bus stops. Here we tried to do bigger bus stops as well as smaller bus stops, so to have a good mix. And for each city, we collected data on 50 bus stops or so.
Okay, ma'am, we have another question. Can you share some examples of how public transport has enabled women to access access better economic opportunities in Indian cities?
So I do have, if I recall, I did a study on Mumbai on this. That was a much earlier iteration of this study. So I learned from their experience and then applied it to the Middle East. I hope someday I'll come back to South Asia and apply the learnings from this study into a version 3.0 of this work, right, on Indian cities. So in that study, I wasn't able to sort of have the richness of what I presented to you today. That's why I didn't present that study. We didn't measure these different measures of public transport service delivery, right? We didn't do accessibility, availability, affordability. We weren't able to measure those econometrically. But what we did find is that the presence of a bus stop close to where women live had a significant impact on their likelihood of working in Mumbai. Now, the constraints that matter vary by geography, vary by city, vary by how do you call it, the culture of a city, so to speak, right? So the constraints that I found in Mumbai might not be the ones that bind in Chennai, for example, or in Delhi, for example. So there are some good pieces of work on the topic, but to my knowledge, there's not necessarily a piece of work that looks quantitatively at this issue in terms of non-self-reported data, because that is in terms of self-reported data, on this topic, you'll always have some reporting biases, so to speak. There is one very good paper by my colleague Girja on school choice in India, university choice in India, where she finds that universities that have a safer route to them, that impacts a woman's choice for the type of school that she attends in terms of university. So women will choose schools that have a safer transportation to them, even though they might not be the best school that they can go to or get into, right? So there's certainly, that's where the investment in some ways, the investment in your human capital is impacted, according to that paper, by the public transport system that you're facing. So I thought that paper was very well done. So that's where it starts. And then, of course, there are huge impacts in terms of women's economic opportunities, whether it be an Indian city, a Bangladeshi city, a Pakistani city, a Nepalese city, or even a Bhutanese city for that matter. No, there will be these differences that you will see.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, as you said, one of the another advantage is, especially with the provision of free services, is social empowerment. In addition to economic empowerment, people are more going, especially the ladies and all those things, they are more engaged in leisure activities. That is some kind of report that has been derived from this Indian, that free bus outcomes. So that is something to be here. Samson, sir?
Thank you, ma'am. That was a good presentation. Nice presentation.
Thank you very much. So the last thing that I'll say is building on something that Professor Sanjay said, right, is that you have to look at how people are using public transportation, whether it be in India or in the Middle East. This is where I've studied this question as yet. Every single city that I look at, when you look at what are people using public transportation for women, a lot of times it is for, domestic chores. So they have to go shopping for the household. They have to accompany an elderly parent or in-law to a hospital. They have to drop their kids off at school and pick them up. So a lot of the uses that women have of public transportation system are not to get to and back and to from work, right? Therefore, a myriad of activities. For men, the primary dominant mode of reason for using public transportation that I found across cities, right, is work, getting back and to from work. Now, both are equally valuable endeavors, right, so to speak. So you need to have access to basic services. You also need to have access to employment opportunities. In this paper, we look at employment opportunities specifically given the paradox that existed in MENA, but you can equally do a study that looks at how do you improve a public transport system so that people are able to engage in in living, as I like to call it, more easily, right? Going to the temple, going to the hospital, going to the school, these are all like aspects of, that's our life, right? We have to do those. We're not like monkeys that are, glued to our tables and we're continuously working. We have to live. So it's an equally worthy thing to look at access to leisure, access to basic services instead of employment opportunities. And then you also have to think about how frequent the service is during peak hours versus off-peak hours, because a lot of women will be using public transport services off-peak hours because they're engaging in these non-economic activities, as we like to think of them. And you could create a difference in terms of, okay, you have a peak fare, and a lot of systems do, right? You have a higher peak fare and you have a lower off-peak fare. You also have to think about chain tripping. So anytime you offer integrated fares, to the extent an off-peak traveler is doing multiple chores and then going back home, they're engaging in chain tripping, right? So any sort of scheme that says, okay, for 2 hours you buy this pass and you can use anything on our system, whether it be a metro, a bus, a BRT, that is a policy that may benefit a certain group of users, and sometimes that group of users can be women. So you don't have to necessarily go to the extreme of offering free transportation for everyone or for a particular segment of society. Again, look at what is their binding constraint, what are they using that mode of transportation for, and find a way to enhance their ridership.
There's one more question. What were the parameters that were used to develop the accessibility index?
So the accessibility index we developed using, so let's talk in terms of parameters and methodology as well, right? So we did Monte Carlo simulations to estimate accessibility. So there's a few parameters you need to be thinking about. What is the walking speed? Sometimes one can argue that women may walk a little bit slowly than men do, because on average they might have less height, they might be accompanied by someone else. So children, they walk more slowly, they might be accompanied by elderly. So that's the first parameter choice that you have to make. What is the speed that people are going to be able to walk in an urban setting? And trust me, people are not walking 3 miles in 1 hour in an urban setting. They're walking that when there's no signals, right? So you have to adjust that speed. The second parameter that you have to look at is, and this is based on actual data that you collect in terms of GTFS, is how frequent the bus arrival is. What is the speed on the bus? This is all data that you can actually collect. As you collect your GTFS data, this is what is documented. And then, of course, where they get off and how far they have to go to get to their job. So now think about it this way. Whether I leave at 8 a.m. versus 8:01 versus 8:02 versus 8:03, right? All of these are going to impact how long I have to wait at the bus stop. If it takes me 2 minutes to walk to the bus stop, I leave at 8:01, the bus comes there at 8:05, there's like 3 minutes or so that I'm spending waiting for the bus. Versus if I leave at 8:02 or 8:03, at 8:04, I've missed my bus. So then I have to wait for the next bus, right? So there's all this uncertainty that is there in the data, depending on the time that you leave. So to account for this uncertainty, then we run a Monte Carlo simulation of people leaving every minute in the peak hour, and what is their likelihood of getting to a job at a certain, within that certain amount of time. Now, if you look at the report, we report on all these indices, varying by reliability of getting there, or reliably how many jobs are available within 1 hour of commute time. We use a 10% reliability, so you get there within 1 hour 10% of the time. We also use a 90% reliability, so 90% of the times you will be able to reach this share of jobs within 1 hour. And then we also use a 50% reliability level, which is like 50-50, right? In our analysis, we use the 50-50 because 90 versus 10 was too conservative or optimistic. But again, collect the parameters based on what is happening actually on the road. You may also want to model in congestion in this index, and then run a Monte Carlo simulation, because people are leaving at different points in time, just like all of us are when you came to this talk. A lot of you use public transport system from the same origin and same destination, you will face a varying time.
Thank you, ma'am. I now invite Dr. Sunitha Vijayan, Junior Scientist, Traffic Engineering and Safety Division, NATPAC, to deliver the vote of thanks. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Chandni. Good evening, everyone. It is my honor and privilege to propose the vote of thanks on behalf of KSCSTE-NATPAC I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to each one of you for joining us today for this insightful and enriching technical talk on the topic, the role of public transport in women's economic empowerment. It has been an enlightening and thought-provoking section illuminating the profound impact of a robust public transport system on women's access to economic opportunities. The talk vividly articulated the concept availability, accessibility, affordability, and safety related to public transportation on women's economic participation. First and foremost, I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to our esteemed speaker, Dr. Muneeza Mehmood, whose expertise and knowledge have truly motivated our audience. Thank you, Dr. Muneeza, for gracing us with your esteemed presence and delivering an inspiring and informative presentation, providing us with much to reflect on. We are deeply appreciative of the valuable knowledge and insights you have imparted to us today. Further, we are immensely grateful to all the attendees for their active engagement and enthusiasm. Your presence and contributions were truly commendable, and they have enriched the discussions and made this event a collaborative success. I would like to extend my profound gratitude to our director, section heads, and the organizing team for their unwavering support, immaculate planning, and coordination that made the smooth execution of this program. In conclusion, I believe we all have gained valuable insights from today's technical talk, making it a memorable and impactful experience. Let us carry this knowledge forward to achieve the goals of sustainability in the transport sector. Thank you once again to everyone involved for your invaluable contributions and participation, and we look forward to hosting more technical talks in this series and continuing this legacy. Thank you. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been a wonderful experience. Take care.
Thank you.